He wore no suit. Said nothing back. Just stood there, quiet and respectful, while a white lawyer mocked him in open court. What that lawyer didn't know was who that boy's father was. And when he walked in, the entire courtroom fell silent. He didn't wear a tie. Didn't have a fancy haircut. Just stood there in a plain black hoodie and khaki pants, staring down at the floor, like he was trying not to breathe too loud. His name was Malik. 17. Honor roll student. Never been in trouble. But today, he was standing in a courtroom, accused of a crime he didn't commit, shoplifting a pair of headphones from a downtown electronics store. It didn't matter that there was no footage. Didn't matter that he had a receipt. Didn't matter that the employee who called the cops couldn't even agree on what the suspect was wearing. He was black. And he was alone. The courtroom was half full, mostly folks waiting for their own hearings. Some moms with toddlers, a few older men, a bailiff drinking from a coffee cup near the back. The walls were beige. The lights flickered. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like waiting in line for bad news. Malik's public defender hadn't even shown up yet. That's when the other lawyer, the one hired by the store's parent company, stood up. A white man, mid-40s. Expensive navy suit. Gold ring. Hair slicked back like a TV anchor. He approached the bench confidently, glancing at Malik like he was staring at an inconvenience. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "the defendant's behavior falls in line with a well-documented pattern of petty theft in this district. Young men, especially those without legal guardians present, often assume that if they steal low-value items, they'll be let off with just a warning." Malik didn't look up. The lawyer continued, louder now, making sure the courtroom could hear. "Now, I'm not saying he's guilty because of how he looks. But let's be honest, It's not exactly shocking to see this kind of profile in this kind of case." Somewhere in the back, a woman shifted in her chair. Another man cleared his throat. But no one said anything. The judge, an older woman with reading glasses and a heavy schedule, looked unimpressed but didn't interrupt. Malik stayed frozen. He wasn't sure if he was more embarrassed, or just numb. He hadn't told his father about this yet. Didn't want to disappoint him. Didn't want him to think his son was weak. That's when the double doors in the back of the courtroom opened. At first, no one noticed. The bailiff didn't look up. The judge didn't pause. But Malik noticed the sound of slow, heavy steps on the wooden floor. He turned his head just slightly. Just enough to see the man walking in. Tall. Graying beard. Federal pin on his lapel. Dark gray overcoat. Eyes like steel under glass. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because the second he crossed the aisle, the entire courtroom began to shift. The bailiff straightened. The judge glanced up sharply. Even the arrogant lawyer paused mid-sentence as if someone had cut the sound. The man didn't sit in the gallery. He walked calmly to the front, leaned toward Malik's public defender, who had finally arrived and was fumbling through a stack of papers, and whispered something into his ear. The defender's eyes widened. He nodded quickly, stepped back, and made room. That man, the one who walked in without a word, stepped forward, adjusted his tie, and said clearly, "Your Honor, I'm requesting permission to speak on behalf of the defendant." The judge blinked, confused for a moment. "And you are?" He held up a small card. Federal black seal. The courtroom fell into complete silence. "I'm Judge Nathaniel Warren," he said. "Federal Circuit. And I'm also his father." Malik looked up, eyes burning. He hadn't told his father. Didn't want him to see this. But somehow, he knew. The arrogant lawyer took a step back. For the first time all day, he didn't have a word to say. Nathaniel Warren stepped fully into the spotlight. His voice calm. Controlled. Every syllable shaped with decades of courtroom command. "Your Honor," he said, "I've reviewed the so-called evidence in this case. I've reviewed the surveillance footage. The receipts. The time-stamped digital transaction from my son's debit card. The fact is, he paid. And he left." He paused, then turned to the corporate lawyer. "What I haven't reviewed is the policy your client used to determine that my son, a minor, with no criminal record, who had already exited the store, should be publicly detained and handed over to police without cause." The lawyer stammered. It was a misunderstanding." Warren stepped forward. "No, sir. It was profiling. It was humiliation. And now, it's going to be a lawsuit." You could hear someone whisper, "Damn," from the back row. The judge raised a hand. "That's enough. Counselor, is this true?" The store's lawyer was pale now. We were just acting on information." "Bad information," Warren said, his voice like a verdict. "And if this weren't my son, I'd still be standing here. Because this happens to kids like him, black kids, every single day. And they don't all have a father who wears a robe." Malik stared at the floor, trying to breathe again. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. Firm. Silent. Forgiving. The judge sighed, looked down at her bench, then said simply, "Case dismissed." The words didn't feel real at first. Case dismissed. Just 2 words. But for Malik, they hit like a wave, slow, powerful, undeniable. The weight he'd been carrying for days suddenly cracked, and then vanished. His knees felt weak. He didn't cry, not there, not in front of everyone, but something deep in his chest trembled. It wasn't just about relief. It was something else. Something older. Because all he'd done was walk into a store. Pay for something. And leave. But that didn't stop the accusation. Didn't stop the officer from pulling him aside in the parking lot. Didn't stop the cuffs. The questions. The sideways looks. And it sure didn't stop the lawyer from smirking when he'd seen who he was. But now that same lawyer was gathering his files like the case had never mattered in the first place. Avoiding eye contact. Clutching his briefcase like it was a shield. The courtroom was quiet. No one clapped. No one cheered. But they felt it. Everyone did. Malik's father, Judge Nathaniel Warren, stepped back from the bench, nodding respectfully to the judge. He didn't gloat. Didn't raise his voice. He simply turned to his son and said, low enough for only Malik to hear, "You don't ever have to carry that silence again." Malik didn't respond. Not yet. He just nodded, and walked out beside him. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed. What had started as just another hearing had turned into whispers. People murmuring in the corridors. A couple of cell phones pointed low, recording. A local reporter who had been there for another case flipped open his notepad and started jotting. But Judge Warren didn't slow down. He walked straight ahead, one hand on Malik's shoulder. Only once they were clear of the crowd, standing in the parking garage, beside Warren's black sedan, did he stop. He turned to Malik and looked at him, really looked. "You didn't tell me," he said softly. Malik stared down at the pavement. "I didn't want you to be disappointed. Thought, maybe I could handle it." Warren didn't scold him. Didn't raise his voice. Instead, he said, "You did. You handled it with more restraint than most grown men I've seen on the stand." Malik looked up, confused. Warren stepped closer. "Son, the system's not designed to apologize to you. You have to understand that. You can be right. You can be polite. You can have the receipt in your hand and still be treated like a suspect." Malik swallowed hard. "But what they don't know," Warren continued, what they keep forgetting is that every time they try to bury someone who looks like you, they might be burying the next judge, the next doctor, the next leader. He paused. And sometimes, they're already here. Later that night, the clip went viral. It wasn't supposed to be filmed, courtrooms had signs, rules, but someone in the back had held their phone just right. The footage was grainy, shaky, but clear enough. The moment Judge Warren stood up. The way the bailiff froze. The lawyer's expression when Warren said, "I'm also his father." It hit Twitter like a spark on dry grass. This is how you handle it. Respect. Power. Justice. Imagine mocking someone, and their dad is a federal judge skull. This had me in tears. Every black kid needs a father like this. In 3 hours, it passed 100,000 views. By morning, national outlets were calling it the day court went quiet. At school, Malik didn't say much. He walked the halls like normal. Hoodie up. Backpack low. Trying not to absorb the stares, the new kind, the ones that weren't pity or suspicion. A girl from biology class gave him a smile in the hallway. 2 boys from gym who'd never spoken to him before gave him a nod. But Malik wasn't looking for attention. All he kept thinking about was that moment. The one where the lawyer said, "I'm not saying he's guilty because of how he looks." The one where nobody stood up, except his father. That's when he knew. He didn't just want to survive moments like that. He wanted to be the kind of man who ends them. That night, Warren found his son sitting at the kitchen table. No phone. No music. Just his laptop open, cursor blinking on a blank college essay. "You writing?" he asked gently. Malik nodded. "Trying." Warren stepped beside him. "What's the prompt?" Malik turned the screen. "Describe a moment that changed your life." They both stared at it. Warren pulled out a chair. Sat beside him. Then said, "Want to tell me how it started?" Malik smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "It started when I didn't say anything back, but he did. The emails started that morning. At first, just a few. A state senator's assistant. A civil rights nonprofit in Atlanta. Then a major podcast host requesting an interview. Judge Warren ignored all of them. He didn't do it for attention. He didn't stand up because he wanted a headline. He stood up because no one else in that courtroom did. But the world had already decided. The clip had crossed 1 million views. And now, news vans were sitting 2 blocks from his courthouse, waiting. Meanwhile, at Malik's school, things weren't as quiet. The same assistant principal who had once called Malik's mom to ask if he hung out with the right crowd, was now smiling a little too wide when she saw him in the hallway. The school counselor asked him if he was okay, with a voice too gentle to be real. But Malik didn't need sympathy. What he needed was space. Because the truth was, he wasn't sure how to feel. He wasn't angry anymore. But he wasn't proud either. The attention didn't heal the sting of being treated like a suspect. And worse, he kept wondering. What if his dad hadn't shown up? What if no camera had recorded it? What if he was just some other kid, still standing in court with no one there? That thought stayed with him. A week passed. The attention didn't fade, it grew. CNN requested a sit-down. The New York Times published an op-ed. Even a federal ethics board quietly reviewed the store's legal team. But Warren stayed quiet. Until one day, he came home late, and Malik was waiting at the table with a laptop open. "I wrote the essay," he said. Warren took off his coat, nodded. "Let's hear it." Malik hesitated. "Then read." "I've always been quiet. The kind of student who sits near the window, hands in pockets, hood up. But last week, I learned that being quiet doesn't mean being invisible. Because sometimes, people will still point fingers, even when you're doing everything right. That day in court, I didn't speak up. I didn't know how. But my father did. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just reminded everyone, including me, that silence can still hold strength. And now, I don't want to be invisible anymore. I want to be seen. And one day, I want to be the one standing in front of that courtroom, protecting someone else. When he finished, Warren didn't speak right away. He just stood there, jaw tight, eyes full. Then he said softly, "That's the most powerful thing I've heard in a long time." The very next day, something unexpected happened. Malik got a letter, real paper, gold seal, official envelope. It was from the National Youth Justice Leadership Program, a mentorship initiative for teens interested in law, social policy, and activism. They'd seen the clip. They'd read his essay. And they wanted to offer Malik a scholarship spot at their summer intensive in Washington, D.C. Malik stared at the letter. Then handed it to his dad. Warren read it, folded it carefully, and smiled. Looks like the courtroom won't be the last place they hear from you. But the real surprise came the next week. Judge Warren was invited to speak at a private law school forum, panel of judges, attorneys, legal scholars. He nearly declined, until he saw who else would be there. The corporate attorney who mocked Malik. Yes, him. Now red-faced from public backlash. Fired from his firm. Invited to speak on bias in the courtroom. The irony burned. But Warren didn't go there to settle scores. He went for one reason, to speak about silence. When it was his turn at the podium, Warren looked out over the crowded room, rows of suits, notepads, laptops glowing. He cleared his throat. "I've spent 26 years in courtrooms," he said. "I've ruled on cases that shook cities, and others that barely made the papers." He paused. "But I've never seen a room fall quieter than the one where a black boy was called guilty before a single fact was read." The room stiffened. And that silence, he continued, wasn't because the law demanded it. It was because too many people were afraid to break it. He looked up, locking eyes with the same man who once stood over his son with a smirk. "I stood up because I was his father. But let me be clear, even if I wasn't, I should have stood. And so should everyone else in that room." Later, after the forum, someone asked Malik if he'd seen the speech. He nodded. Then said something his father never expected. "I don't want to just be in courtrooms anymore. I want to run them." It started as a quiet idea. Just a thought Malik scribbled into the back of a notebook during history class. He didn't even tell anyone at first. Not his friends. Not his dad. Not even himself, not out loud. But over the next few weeks, that idea started growing. Because Malik realized something. For the first time in his life, people were listening to him. Not because he raised his voice. Not because he demanded attention. But because of what he had been through, and how he stood through it. So one afternoon, he stayed after school. Walked into the guidance office, sat down, and said 6 words that made the counselor pause. "I want to start a group." The idea was simple. A place for students to talk about what they've been through. Racial bias. Policing. School discipline. Teachers who assume. Security guards who follow. Students who joke about acting ghetto or talking white. Malik called it "Stand Quiet." Because he wanted everyone to know, silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes, silence is what keeps you standing when the world's already shouting you down. The first meeting had 5 kids. All of them had a story. One boy who'd been suspended for talking back when he asked why he was being searched. A girl whose older brother was wrongly arrested for matching a description. Another who just said, "Sometimes I feel like no one expects me to graduate." Malik didn't talk much that first meeting. He just listened. And he understood. Because he had felt it too. By the third week, there were 20 students. Then 40. Then a teacher offered her classroom. Then the principal called Malik in and asked how they could support the program. And then, a camera crew showed up from a national morning show. They wanted to feature Malik. Interview him. Put him in front of millions. But he turned them down. He didn't want the spotlight anymore. What he wanted, what he needed, was something that lasted longer than one viral clip. Meanwhile, Judge Warren was facing something himself. Behind closed doors, in quiet federal rooms, whispers had started. Some judges called his courtroom speech inappropriate. One attorney anonymously said it showed lack of neutrality. Others, quietly, thanked him. He was pulled into a disciplinary review. Not formal. Not public. Just a behind-the-scenes check-in. A concern about how personal involvement might have blurred the lines. Warren stood calm through all of it. Until they asked him, "Do you regret your actions?" He looked at the review panel and said, "I regret that my son had to stand alone before I walked in." A few days later, Malik came home to find his father on the porch. Not reading. Not working. Just sitting. There was something in the air. Something unsaid. Malik sat beside him. For a moment, they just watched the wind move through the trees. Then Malik asked, "Are they going to fire you?" Warren exhaled. "No. But, they want me quiet." Malik nodded slowly. "I get that." Warren looked at him. "Do you?" Malik smiled faintly. "Yeah. But I'm not listening to them either." Later that week, Malik was invited to a youth conference, a gathering of student leaders across the state. They wanted him to speak. He stood behind the podium in a black button-down and slacks. Nervous. Hands slightly shaking. The lights were bright. The room quiet. He looked out at the crowd. Then said, "Last year, I would have told you I didn't belong here. I was just a kid in a hoodie who kept his head down. But now I know, sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who've learned to listen. And sometimes, they become the loudest voice in the room. Not because they want to be heard, but because no one else was speaking." The crowd clapped. Some stood. Malik didn't smile big. He didn't pose. He just nodded, the same way his father did in court. And in the back row of that auditorium, Judge Warren sat quietly. He didn't film it. Didn't clap too hard. Didn't even tell anyone he was there. He just watched. Proud. Silent. Because that day, the courtroom belonged to his son. Malik didn't plan on ever seeing that lawyer again. The man who mocked him, who tried to twist the truth with a smirk and a shrug, he was supposed to be gone. Finished. Buried under the shame of his own arrogance. But fate had other plans. It was a university law symposium. Malik had been invited to speak on a youth panel, student leaders, future advocates, a mix of high school and early college voices. And the keynote speaker? A disbarred lawyer turned consultant, offering seminars on accountability and redemption. There he was, the same man from that courtroom. Polished. Rebranded. Even humble on the surface. But Malik saw right through it. The man's eyes still held that same flicker, not shame, but calculation. He was trying to rewrite his story. Turn a moment of failure into a platform. Make the world forget what really happened that day. Malik sat through the speech. Quiet. Focused. But when it was his turn on stage, something changed. The moderator introduced him as an aspiring legal mind and youth leader. He stood, adjusted the mic, glanced once at the man in the front row, and began. When I was 17, I was accused of something I didn't do. No names. No details. Just a tone that shifted the room. I stood in court that day and watched a grown man twist the truth. Not because the facts were unclear, but because the person standing on the other side of the table looked like me. He paused. That man was older, respected, educated, and wrong. There was a stillness in the room now. Even the moderator leaned back in his chair. But I learned something that day. Power doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes, it comes in a quiet voice. A steady hand. A refusal to back down. Malik looked out over the audience. His voice didn't rise. He didn't perform. He just told the truth. I'm not here because someone gave me permission. I'm here because I stopped waiting for someone else to define who I was. When he stepped off stage, people clapped. A few students stood. And the lawyer, the man who once called him the confused young man in the hoodie, didn't say a word. He avoided eye contact, gathered his bag, and left before the closing remarks. Malik didn't smile. He didn't need to. The moment had already passed, and this time, the silence belonged to someone else. That night, Malik rode home with his father. They didn't talk much at first. The streetlights flickered past the windshield. The world felt quieter than usual. Then Judge Warren said, without turning his head, "You know what I saw up there today?" Malik raised an eyebrow. "What?" "A future someone's gonna underestimate," he said. "And regret it." Malik smirked. "You think I went too hard?" "No," Warren said. "I think you went honest." A few days later, an email landed in Malik's inbox. It was from a state representative's office, a staffer who had watched his speech online. They were drafting a bill on courtroom bias. They wanted his voice. His story. His help. It wasn't symbolic. It was policy. Real law. Real change. Malik read the message twice. Then 3 times. Then called his father into the room. "Dad," he said, holding out the phone. "They want me to help write it." Judge Warren stared at the screen, then looked at his son. "You ready for that?" Malik nodded. "I've been ready since the day he called me guilty." The bill wasn't flashy. It didn't promise to fix everything. But it required every courtroom in the state to complete a racial bias training, not just for police, but for lawyers, clerks, even judges. And it mandated that courtroom footage be made public unless sealed by a ruling, so no more quiet cover-ups, no more hidden injustice. The media called it Malik's Law. He didn't. To him, it wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure the next kid didn't have to wait for a federal judge to walk through the door. The story made national news again. Not because of another viral clip, but because of the change it inspired. Malik never bragged. He never posted a victory thread. He didn't even retweet the headlines. But in his own quiet way, he started something bigger than himself. And one morning, 6 months later, he walked into his high school principal's office with a file folder in hand. "What's this?" the principal asked. "A proposal," Malik said. "For what?" Malik set the folder down. Looked the man in the eyes. "A law class. For students like me." The graduation stage wasn't fancy. Just folding chairs, a simple podium, and the school band softly playing beneath a cloudy spring sky. But to Malik, it looked like a summit. A place he never knew he'd stand so tall. He adjusted the collar of his gown. His name card felt damp in his hand, not from nerves, but from something deeper. Something like quiet disbelief. Just a year ago, he was being searched in a store parking lot, cuffed, labeled, humiliated. Now, he was valedictorian. Not because of sympathy. Not because of what went viral. But because when the system tried to break him, he held the line. His father sat in the second row, dressed not in robes or robes of office, but in a plain navy suit, proud, quiet, and smiling in a way only a father could. No press this time. No cameras. Just a community. Family. Classmates. All there for a simple ceremony, and a few life-changing moments. When Malik's name was called, the crowd clapped, louder than expected. Not polite. Not routine. Genuine. He stepped onto the stage. And when he looked out over the crowd, he didn't see reporters or trending hashtags. He saw the faces of students he had helped. He saw a younger classmate from Stand Quiet beaming from the back row. He saw his mother, wiping a tear. And his father, with that same steady look, the one that said, "You earned this." Later that night, after the party and the photos and the cake, Malik stood outside on the porch. He had the acceptance letter in one hand, a full scholarship to Howard University. He had a copy of the bill he'd helped write tucked into his jacket. And he had something else, too. A letter. Sealed. Handwritten. From his father. He opened it slowly. "Malik. I didn't teach you how to be strong, you already were. I only showed you that your strength had a place in this world. That it could make change. That it could stand taller than silence. The day I stood in that courtroom, I wasn't wearing the robe. But I was still a judge, and more importantly, I was your father. I don't know what this world will throw at you next. But I do know this. It won't be ready for the man you're becoming. Dad." Malik folded the letter. Held it tight. Then looked up at the sky. There were no spotlights now. No one recording. Just the wind, the stars, and the future. 2 years later, he stood in another courtroom. Not as a defendant. Not even as a student observer. But as a law intern, assigned to a judge reviewing cases of wrongful youth convictions. And one morning, a familiar name appeared on the docket. The same store. The same security officer. A case that looked eerily like his own, but with a younger boy. Alone. Scared. Accused. Malik didn't flinch. He walked into chambers, quietly handed the judge a file he'd prepared, and said, "I know this case. I lived it." The judge blinked. Then nodded slowly. "Let's make sure he doesn't have to. Some people change the system by yelling at it. Some by breaking it. But some change it by simply refusing to be broken by it." Malik never raised his voice in that courtroom. But somehow, the whole world heard him anyway.